First person we have is Professor Evans Chan, which is the director. He's an independent filmmaker, writer, and librettist based in Hong Kong and New York. His work focuses on capturing Hong Kong's modern history in a dozen fiction and documentary features. Chan has directed Hong Kong's first digitally filmed fiction feature, The Map of Sex and Love in 2002, and Journey to Beijing, the only independently produced documentary about Hong Kong's 97 handover. His most recent documentaries on Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement includes Raise the Umbrellas, which is about the Occupy movement of 2014. Raise the Umbrellas was screened at UC San Diego in 2017. Chan's latest documentary about Hong Kong turbulent protests, We Have Boots, the one we just watched, was premiered at the 2020 International Film Festival in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. It won the Edward Snowden Documentary Award at the Science of Night Film Festival in Berlin. And then We Have Boots West Coast premiere, which is going on right now, is presented by the San Diego Asian Film Festival. And director Chan is also a film scholar with a doctorate in screen culture film studies from Northwestern University. Next panelist is Professor Eddy Yu. Professor Eddy Yu is a professor in the Department of Sociology and East Asian Studies at UC Davis. His research focuses on the history of Chinese socialism. His recent book, Creating the Intellectual, Chinese Communism, The Rise of a Classification, is about the rise of primary classification of people in China and how the process shapes societal structures and culture. It tells the compelling story of a social change, and the book was awarded the 2020 Barrington Moore Award by the American Sociology Association. Professor Yu teaches a sociology course on markets, culture, and inequality in contemporary China, and is also planning to teach a seminar on democracy and authoritarian in Hong Kong this spring quarter. And he grew up in Hong Kong but came to the U.S. as an international student during the 80s. Next is Professor Victor Shih. Professor Victor Shih is an associate professor of political economy at the UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategic and the Ho Mio Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations. His research looks at the politics of both Chinese physical and monetary policy. Professor Shih is the author of Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation, and the editor of the new book, Economic Shocks and Authority and Stability. He is also furthering research on how coalition formation has impacted the direction of the Chinese Communist Party, and currently teaches Financing the Chinese Miracle, Chinese Source and Methods, Chinese Politics, and the Political Economy, Authoritarian Regimes. The last professor we have is Professor Kwai. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology at UCSD and researches sociology of law, legal language, and social theory. And his book, The Common Law and Two Voices, Language, Law, and the Post-Colonial Predicament in Hong Kong, discusses how Hong Kong's bilingual common law system affects the legal system, as it is one of the very few common law institutions in the world that have two languages. And we also have, who will be moderating on our panel, is Shireen is going to be moderating our panel. And you will be able to, and we also have Sam, sorry, one more person. I'm so sorry. We also have Samuel Soy. He's the assistant director of the 21st Century China Center at UCSD, where he produces events, programs, and a podcast to promote research and constructive dialogue on U.S.-China relations. He's also a fellow at Rise San Diego, where he co-founded Welcoming San Diego, which works to integrate new immigrants into the San Diego area. He's originally from Hong Kong, but he moved to Boston in his primary school age, and his own uses that experience to help shape his desire to work with immigrants today. So we're going to be doing the moderating panel, and then thank you for that, and I'll hand it over to Shireen and the panel for the rest of it.
Hi, thank you everyone for attending our panel discussion again. So first of all, we'll have Director Evan Chen do a little bit sharing about his documentary. So thank you, Director Chen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, I mean, the film you just saw, I don't know what I should say, but basically I'll just tell you how this film came about. My film, Raise the Umbrella, was screened at a Make University tour in 2017 and 18, I guess. And Professor Kwai was there, when I came to San Diego. I guess Professor Victor Shih was away, but anyway, I mean, I'm glad to meet you here tonight online. Well, I mean, that film was made, and it's about the umbrella movement, and I would, I guess, tonight actually the streaming you saw is from Berkeley, UC Berkeley will be streaming this program 2 in 1, it's a double bill, Raise the Umbrellas, my Umbrella Revolution or Umbrella Movement documentary from 2016. And what you just saw, We Have Boots, is a double bill and will be streamed for, 6 weeks, meaning it started already, so it will end on December 5. So, I mean, if any of you want to go in and look at Raise the Umbrellas, I mean, you can still watch it because the San Diego Film Festival's streaming of We Have Boots will be ending Saturday. Yeah. So anyway, this is just information. Yeah, for whoever your community, academic community information. So I made Raise the Umbrellas, and in 2018, the Lingnan University in Hong Kong presented a retrospective on my work, and they will show Raise the Umbrellas. At that time, I was thinking, okay, they're going to show Raise the Umbrellas, but it's kind of old by then. So I thought that maybe I just make a shortish companion piece to go with it. But then, of course, I mean, I start interviewing Benny Tai, all these follow-up interviews, and they were already reacting to the upcoming trial of them, taking place at the end of the year. So, I mean, I just feel that all of a sudden I'm catching a different mood. And of course, all this disqualification, etc., was ongoing. So, the very early version of We Have Boots was screened at the year end of 2018. And it was only 17 minutes. And then, it so happened that the film, that work in progress, was premiered on the eve of the trial of the Occupy 9, so-called, the initiating committee and initiators, etc. So, I mean, there's a trial coming up. So what will happen to them? So, I mean, and of course, I mean, I follow up after the trial, and then and then things just get escalating. I mean, things were just escalating all the time in Hong Kong. And then by the time the film was invited to Rotterdam in the Netherlands for its premiere in January of this year, so I delivered the film incorporating, I think that, what made Hong Kong became international headline news was the anti-extradition movement in the latter half of 2019. So the completed film you saw ends on January 1st of this year. So that's the completed film you saw, and then it was premiered at the U.S. premiere was at the D.C. Film Fest. The Washington D.C. International Film Festival, and so that was happening in June. At that time, I was sort of aware that the new national security law is about to be passed. So there was some sort of epilogue. But technically, this film is still completed before the national security law came into being. So yeah, I will answer questions. But basically, the film can no longer be screened in Hong Kong because even back in June, I was talking with some Hong Kong distributors and portals. They already asked me to cut because the national anthem legislation was enacted. Because you know there was a segment of when this performance artist was using the national anthem, and so I have to cut that already. And then after the national security law was passed, I mean there are simply too many things to be cut from the film, I guess. So I mean nobody would touch it any longer, and that's where we are today.
Thank you for sharing, Director Chen. And so we also have some question for you. So I know for now, the obstacle that you face probably is because of the national security law. But when you were making the documentary, did you face any major roadblocks?
Oh, well, I mean, one major roadblock is, of course, I mean, I request an interview with Carrie Lam, and that was turned down. It's not surprising, but anyway, that's what I did and tried to accomplish. And she did not refer me to anybody else to help elucidate our understanding of the government decision, etc. So, I mean, I want to bring that up because especially with Raise the Umbrellas, there was always the accusation of me being one-sided. Of course, it wasn't. I mean, I think because I came to UC San Diego, and then there was all these, and when it traveled through the U.S., a lot of the Chinese students came to ask that question, and I think that because they didn't know Hong Kong politics. I did interview Jasper Zheng, who was a well-known pro-Beijing politician in Hong Kong. He said as such in the film. So I mean, I did give him quite a platform, and I did show, anti-Occupy demonstrations and all that. But I mean, my film is not about why something shouldn't happen. I'm always making films about why something happened and how it happens. And that's what you saw. I mean, we are not going to go back in time, say something shouldn't happen. I mean, you can go endlessly back in time to speculate about, why something shouldn't have happened, but it happens. And you have to understand why and how it happened in order to deal with it. So, I mean, I brought up the fact that I tried to interview Carrie Lam. I do want to offer them a platform to defend or, explain why something was done and happened and how they handle it. And since I didn't get that interview, I try as much as I can to present their point of view through, citations and the Hong Kong government's official videos, including Lam's own statement. So, I mean, that's where I am. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing, Director Chen. So for now, we also wanted to ask the professors about your thoughts on the documentary. So yeah, you can just voice out if you have any sharing. Thank you.
Well, perhaps I'll just say a few words. I want to say hi to Evans. It's been a while, and
Yeah, sure, yeah. Glad to see you again.
I glad to see you. I remember um, watching the documentary Race the Umbrella in San Diego with you in the audience and answering questions from the students. I think at the time, if you tell me that there's going to be a sequel, and the sequel would be something like what we saw tonight, um, I would not have believed it. The development, uh, what happened in 2019, it was really beyond the imagination of a lot of people. But then I think watching the documentary tonight, you also see a certain continuity, and I think you stressed it through interviewing um, parties and participants of like different political fashion. They really see what happened last year as a result of the umbrella movement, the Occupy movement, and how the government responded to it. And and I remember there's a quote in the documentary that Hong Kong is a very difficult book to read. And I think even for some of the people in Hong Kong, it is true because there's a lot of like contingency in the society, and there's a lot of like factors, and not all the factors uh, are things that are constantly or are solidly aligned. It's a very fluid situation in Hong Kong, and so that's what I want to share. I know there must be a lot of like questions, and I understand for many of us who share a history with Hong Kong, a place that we grew up. There's a lot of emotions. So I want to keep it brief, and I think there will be a lot of questions coming up in the next half hour.
So I actually have a question. I'll pick on Kwai and Eddy, who are sociologists, because sociologists are known for studying social movements more so than we political scientists. How do you guys see the umbrella movement and the subsequent social movements? How do you see the movement in Hong Kong in comparison with some of the sort of more classical social movements that are often mentioned in the literature, but also mentioned by the leaders, the activist leaders in Hong Kong, such as the independence movement in India and also the civil rights movement in the United States?
Eddy.
That is certainly a very difficult question to answer. But I think, first of all, very glad to meet you, Director Chen, and congratulations on making a rich, moving, and inspiring movie. And that question, Victor's question, is very difficult to answer. But Evans captured in his documentary, there's a certain core beliefs among the protesters, but there are also many moving parts and different ideas coming through. And at the same time, he also captured the struggles, internal struggles, psychological struggle, moral struggles, struggle between jobs, families, and the sense of fairness and justice. Those, I think, is something that every social movement encounters and has to endure, as well as the type of resistance in society that is going to go against these protesters and whatever they are going to do. And one of the things that a lot of commentators have talked about is how big an obstacle these protesters are going up and eventually finding themselves going up and really going up against. And this is the Chinese Communist Party is um, becoming stronger and stronger, even though there are some scholarship that suggests that the foundation of this regime is not as strong. But I differ on with those kind of opinions. So I empathize with these with the determination as well as the obstacle faced by the protesters. The civil rights movement definitely did not confront this kind of brutality and the capacity of this regime to be really brutal if we look back into the history of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, you want to continue? I want to respond. Selma did get a lot of violence. Maybe that's not state violence. At least that was how the police was reacting or whatever, or going on the offensive. But in terms of the umbrella movement and even the going into the anti-extradition movement, I saw some sort of global circulation of ideas because Benny Tai was very explicit that Martin Luther King Jr.'s a letter from Birmingham jail was an inspiration. And there are many elements in this film that I feel hits home very close. In the sense that I talk about it elsewhere because I became very friendly with Harvey Shapiro, the New York Times book editor and the Sunday Times magazine editor, in the last 10 years of his life. He died in 2013. And then in the New York Times obituary, on the very first paragraph was about Harvey Shapiro, was actually the one that commissioned Martin Luther King Jr. to write that essay, the seminal essay for the civil rights movement. What could I say? So I knew Harvey, I knew that already. Of course, but the fact that the first paragraph of his obituary in the New York Times was about that major assignment of his life. So when I attended Harvey's memorial in New York in 2014, the umbrella movement happened already, and I was about to go back. I've been living in New York for a long time. I'm not a full-time resident of Hong Kong. So when I went back, I went back to Hong Kong and I was an interview with Benny Tai, and the moment when he talked about this essay being the inspiration for the movement, I was quite astonished, because here I am, coming to New York. Leaving Hong Kong years ago for my graduate study and hence staying, and then going back to Hong Kong to encounter the American influence that way. So there is and also the Occupy movement, of course it evolved or whatever, mutated into the umbrella movement, but the initial Occupy idea is very also sort of a pedagogical campaign, they have many workshops and try to educate the public about civic culture, basically. So I mean, there is, of course, I mean, and then Martin Luther King Jr. was influenced by Gandhi. I mean, there's a lot, the whole history behind the civil rights movement, how they came about. Thoreau first came up with that term, then Gandhi picked it up, and then Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by Gandhi, and and so I find it's very interesting. In the way I was saying that is how this global exchange has finally returned to Asia and to Hong Kong, and picking up that tradition, the Southern tradition in China, how the opposition has originated, since the 19th century. I mean, Dr. Sun Yat-sen is from Hong Kong. I mean, Kang Youwei is from Hong Kong. Lang Qiqia is from Hong Kong. I mean, it's all these Southern Chinese confronting the center. And so, I mean, to some extent, I saw that as part of that tradition, whether it's good or bad or whatever. Anyways, the dynamic that is impacting China right now, and whether Hong Kong is just going to become part of China without much say, so to speak. And how will that still be impacting China? We don't know. It remains to be seen. But I mean, so there is that very interesting exchange. And and I mean, if some of you have looked at the Black Lives Matter, protests in the U.S. recently, I mean, there was all this story comparing Hong Kong to Portland, for example. And a lot of these symbols and images and tactics are circulating. And not only in terms of the protest, and even the American police tactics, did they, learn from the Hong Kong police as well? Attacking the media, attacking reporters, etc. I mean, that's what they did in Hong Kong. So, I mean, I don't know, it's a very complex playbook. I mean, both on the side of the government and on the side of the protests. So it is, I mean, of course, we all know that we live in such a globalized world, anything just travel instantly, anything can be seen anywhere, and then people pick it up. So I think, we are in that space of very intense interaction. And also Hong Kong's changes, more than different people were talking about it, Hong Kong's exchange, I mean, changes in Hong Kong since 97 is sort of slow motion. But in the last, I don't know, in the last decade, it really accelerated. And is really at really accelerating speed, even in the last few years. Even from the time I finished Umbrellas to Boots was completed, to the Boots could no longer be seen in Hong Kong, is really, hard to imagine, that things are moving so fast.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the sharing again. So right now we will start the Q&A section. So if anyone has any question, you can send your question to the Q&A on the chat through direct messages, or you can raise your hand to ask the question too. And actually, we have already got some question from the audience. So the question is for everyone to answer. So please feel free to answer. The first one is, what are the prospects for localism in the future? Will localist sentiment grow or shrink? And is it either desirable? So yeah, please feel free to answer.
That really is not a question for me to answer, I mean, I am a filmmaker. I try to report on different perspectives. But of course, I mean, just based on the observation, the Mosisto was dismantled the moment the national security law was enacted June 30th. I mean, they disband. The next thing is nation law went overseas, and in terms of, at least I can tell you, one change of mind among the localists is Ray Wong. I mean, I have appeared in other online forum with Ray Wong recently, also because of the film. And Ray Wong already is no longer advocating independence for Hong Kong. He just felt that that's not the focus. You mean his focus still autonomy for Hong Kong? He did not even talk about self-determination. So I mean, I think they are aware that it is really touching. Many localists are aware that they are really touching the red line. So I think that they have second thought and they seem to be backing up, but it's an observation, please. I mean, I don't speak for any, I don't really cannot speak for them. Yeah, so basically that's my observation. It's not something that I'm speaking for them.
So I'll add an observation here to kind of reinforce what Evans just said. The passage of the national security law of Hong Kong was not just a legal thing. I mean, to me, as a political scientist, it was a regime change. So, of course, Hong Kong, prior to July 1st, didn't have a well-functioning democracy, which is why the protesters were protesting and advocating for it. But it was still somewhat representative legislature coupled with a top-down authoritarian executive. But with the passage of the law, I think the legislature more or less has been rendered powerless. Judicial branch, which had some autonomy prior to the passage of the national security law, also had some degree of autonomy. But I think that the law more or less has disempowered the judiciary branch in Hong Kong also. So now Hong Kong now just has a full-blown authoritarian regime. And in some respect, I would say that the situation in Hong Kong is even worse than the one in mainland China. So in mainland China, you not only have the security type organizations, you also have the municipal Chinese Communist Party, you have municipal government, you have different agencies, and if the security organs were to overstep their authorities, the other communists actually would push back and lobby against the security agencies. In the case of Hong Kong, very few bureaucrats, very few Hong Kong government officials are in the Communist Party. I believe there are some who are in the Communist Party. Some say Carrie Lam or, the head of police, Deng Se, right? Who knows, right? But in any event, they only represent a small minority in the Hong Kong government. And so now that there is this directly controlled by Beijing security organization in Hong Kong, it has no check on its power, actually, within Hong Kong. Zero. So no one in Hong Kong can push back on these people, and they can do whatever they want. And we're beginning to see the manifestation of this, so people getting detained, there's no due process, they disappear, they are sent to mainland China, who knows what happens to them, and not a single peep from the other officials in Hong Kong, of course, as this is happening. So it stands to reason why some of these activists are being more careful because, and unfortunately, I think sort of maybe worse is to come.
So I want to add another dimension to what Victor just said. The influence or the harm that will be done by the national security law reaches to North America and other places, because this is a threat to try to muffle overseas voices for the Hong Kong democracy movement as well. Take for instance, to pressure overseas Hong Kong students to go back to the dorm and keep quiet rather than organizing event on campus, setting up booths, running signature campaign, contacting U.S. congressional representative. All these activities now will can be seen as violations under the national security law. So this is huge obstacles, not only for the movement in Hong Kong, as Victor put it, but there are also increasing obstacle to do things for Hong Kong overseas.
Yeah, that universal jurisprudence. Yeah, I mean, jurisdiction is haunting. Yeah, I mean, so we know that. So one problem of my film being shown in Hong Kong is, even though the film was completed before the national security law was enacted, what about the continuing showing of it? Now it's being shown. Is it against the national security law? I mean, I'll talk about the censorship situation a little bit. Now, interesting enough, recently there were two films being shown in Hong Kong. One is about the legislature's occupation July 1st. And then another one is about the siege of the Polytechnic University. I mean, and actually these two films are just picked up by the documentary festival in the Netherlands. Now, number one, who are the directors? The credit is Hong Kong documentary filmmakers. No one is going to own it. And number two, it got, at first, there was all these hoopla about, the censor sent back the DVD and it was broken up, all shattered, why did they do that and this and that. But they finally allowed the two films to be shown. But with the disclaimer, or sort of required, saying that some of the things being shown in the film can be deemed as illegal under the new national security law. So, I mean, those films were shown, but, you have to give such a disclaimer in order for those films to be shown. I don't know, even with such a disclaimer, this film can be shown. In any case, I mean, this is what is ongoing. And the fact that, filmmakers dare not claim ownership of the film, is already an indication of the difficulties operating under the new regime here.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from the audience. So is that what are some ways that student activists in the United States help the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong? Yeah, please say that. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's a question I should answer, because I mean, I still am bearing witness to the extent that I still play the role of being a journalist. It's not my role to offer advice. I mean, I'm not writing editorial. So yeah. So I mean, whoever other panelists can answer that. Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
I
Go
would
ahead. Go
say,
ahead, Kwai.
uh, Eddie, do you want to say something?
Go ahead first, Kwai.
Well, I'll be brief. Uh, I think you keep doing what you've been doing. Um, the national security law is deliberately vague, because its vagueness create a certain kind of like uh, uh, well, it's deterrence, turns on its vagueness, right? You don't know what is going to happen. But as you just said, you are talking about supporting the democratic movement in Hong Kong. There's nothing wrong with supporting the democratic movement in Hong Kong. Um, so I, one thing I would, of course, you you be aware of some of um, the activities that the national security law uh, redlined. But on the other hand, I don't think even now uh, asking for a more democratic legislature, for example, um, and supporting the election of Hong Kong, the existing election of Hong Kong, is anything that is problematic. Um, as for the question of what would be the most effective way to do it, I don't know. I don't think if I'm the most qualified person to talk about it. Um, but I know many students have been offering support in different ways, and I think those activities can be continued. Eddie.
Thanks, Kwai. Um, I want to say that this occasion is an excellent example of how overseas Hong Kong students are prepared to continue to put in efforts to promote democratic change in Hong Kong. Um, we, I think no one knows whether this kind of discussion actually violates the national security law. But anyways, students decide to come together and exercise the freedom of speech and freedom of association in the American tradition, and continue to have a conversation about what is going on in Hong Kong. This is an example of what you are doing. Um, on campuses, um, some universities, including mine, have been talking about installing preventive measures in to tell students that classes may involve some sensitive material, to use encryption for class discussion, to protect the students' right to intellectual engagement. But the bigger problem is, what can Hong Kong students do outside of the classroom? Are campuses going to protect their rights to exercise free speech, just as other groups, Americans or whoever, exercise their political speech on campus? And here we don't see outright statements or positions taken by any universities, to my recollection, that tell students, we are here to protect your right to political speech. And that is a little bit disheartening for me. And I'm not sure universities would actually go that far to say Hong Kong students have the right to say that they support democratic change in Hong Kong. Oh, by the way, I want to also draw inspiration from the Hong Kong protesters themselves. The things that they do after the national security law has been passed. They hold up blank piece of paper. right? And they do other things that's very creative to continue the movement in creative ways.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing here. I mean, I agree with everything that Kwai and Eddy have said, obviously, and I think, free speech, I think will be protected, especially if it comes under some kind of duress. I think, the UC system is pretty good at when something bad happens, they react to it. But yeah, until such a time as that happens, maybe they're not going to make a sort of a affirmative statement. But the other thing I would like to add is that if you bear in mind some of the classical social movements like India independence and the US civil rights, ultimately these movements aim to persuade people from their oppressing group to change their mind, right? And so I don't know what that means in the context of, North, Hong Kongers or people of Hong Kong origin in North America. But certainly it means that they should continue a dialogue with mainland Chinese students and colleagues, because that's the process, and it should not stop.
And all that I can add is, as a filmmaker, of course, you believe in communications. You always feel that, it's only through communications conflicts can be resolved. And again, it's an observation about the Hong Kong situation. And I think that Professor Andrew Nathan at Columbia wrote briefly about the film, and he was saying that, the Hong Kong situation, the government's reaction, keep radicalizing the youth in Hong Kong has become this vicious circle. And I mean, with all this talk about civil disobedience entering Hong Kong society, and Martin Luther King Jr. entering Hong Kong society, or the discourse at least rising from the Hong Kong movements, I mean, I had the feeling that ultimately it's actually Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X met on the streets of Hong Kong, and you saw both things happening. And I mean, and that's because, the conflicts was so stark, and the government is so uncompromising. And then, a massive peaceful protest, demands are not met. So and again, I feel that I try to present what it was. And, unless that, as I said, as I kept saying, is unless you understand something that you don't want to see, why it happened and how it happened, you cannot make it go away, and I think that's the only way of helping the situation. I mean, I don't know how China feels. And I feel that it's very sad, to see, I mean, even the situation in the US right now. It's as though it's a zero-sum game, and either China succeed or, the US succeed, and, I mean, who wants China to fail? I mean, nobody wants it. I mean, Arif Derlik, whom I dedicate the film to, he was in at least 3 of my films, and I mean, he was welcomed by the Chinese academia, very recently, and before he died. I mean, who wants China to fail? I mean, how many people will suffer? We all want China to succeed, but how? And to what extent that its own people, I mean now including Hong Kong, don't feel that they have to pay a heavy price for what China considered to be success. So I mean, that's why I want to say we all want China to succeed, but how? And also, it's up to China to make the world see how it succeeds in what way. And we are reaching that point. And whatever, I mean, whether we have a Trump presidency after November 3rd or a Biden presidency, I mean, they have to deal with it. And it's unfortunate in some cases that Hong Kong, become this battleground. I mean, just today we heard that, the Hong Kong paper, Apple Daily, is behind the Biden misinformation campaign, and then, Jimmy Lai denied that. And honestly, I just don't, I mean, as somebody who makes films about Hong Kong, I don't want Hong Kong to be caught in that kind of controversy. But I mean, unfortunately, that's where we are. And again, as I said, that nobody wants China to fail. We all want China to succeed. I mean, I'm a cultural Chinese, so I mean, I have my parents are from China. I have relatives in China. I spent my childhood in Macau. I went to college in Hong Kong. I attended graduate school in the U.S. So I mean, I don't really have a very strong national affiliation or over identification. I mean, I'm just a cultural Chinese, and I want, why should I want China to fail? I mean, I feel most people don't want to. And then if Hong Kong was locked into a situation being antagonistic to China, I feel very unfortunate because I mean, that's not how I feel. I mean, when I left Hong Kong, I was more disgusted with British colonialism. So, I mean, it just is a very complex situation that we are caught in. And I just wish that, we can see a more peaceful resolution to the Hong Kong situation and all that.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving on, we have a question, an interesting one raised by Professor Choi. How do we explain some Hong Kongers' support for Donald Trump, and what are some useful actions from the Hong Kong diaspora, including students?
That's an interesting question. Well, so I think part of it has to do with the fact that the Trump administration has some, fairly hardline China hawks, including, what's the name of this guy who used to be in the Wall Street Journal? Actually, he interviewed me a long time ago. And as well as other, trade officials and so on and so forth. And so I think, people like maybe Jimmy Lai. So yeah, who knows what's happening with this Apple Daily thing? Like he didn't know. Okay, well, let's say he didn't know about this opposition research. So that's why I think some of the activists gravitate toward Donald Trump and his administration because it has been very tough on China. It imposed a tariff. I mean, the tariff, you have I mean, now we're kind of used to the idea of a tariff against China, but this was like unthinkable, just 4 years ago. And no one in the Obama administration would talk about a tariff. Zero. Because, obviously, in a pure economic sense, it's like welfare losing, and, why would we do that? We'd be shooting ourselves in the foot. As it turns out, actually, even though the benefits to the U.S. are not so clear, the harm to the U.S. also have not been so clear. So it turns out to be, if your objectives are things other than maximizing welfare, it's not an inconceivable strategy. So I think, this kind of tough policy stance has made people gravitate. But at the end of the day, the problem, I mean, I'll just have very briefly comment on the Trump administration, is that it is pretty anti-democratic, right? So if if one is strongly in favor of democratic principles, it would not be the strongest supporter for Trump just on that basis alone. I mean, if your policy preferences is like other things, like low taxes or something like that, then I would say, yeah, go ahead and support Trump. You want low taxes, and he's very consistent in that. But if you feel strongly about democracy, then the Trump administration really is not. And I would also add that the Biden people are not completely naive. I think the kind of partial success, or at least the lack of disaster from a hardline approach, has really opened the eyes of a lot of foreign policy experts, including those who are close to the potential Biden administration.
I'll try, even though I don't think I can answer this question fully. Um, we can look at Hong Kongers in Hong Kong as well as overseas Hong Kongers, those who are in the United States. And they are two different groups of people. And Victor explained the Hong Kongers and the gravitation toward Trump. In the United States, it is also a very interesting phenomenon. Some overseas Hong Kong immigrants, they seem to become, some of them, I suppose, is becoming one issue voter. So this is the most important issue. Hong Kong, maintaining Hong Kong's original or status before July 1st or even earlier. That becomes the single issue that's most important to some of the voters. The other thing is that probably they also ideologically is also more similar to the Republican Party. That is to say, pro-life and other kinds of platform of the Republican Party that draws the interests of overseas Hong Kongers who are in the United States and who are citizens and who have the rights to vote. But in the end, I think whether it is the Biden administration or the Trump administration, the United States would still be what I call an unreliable partner for the Hong Kong democracy movement. Because the United States governments have its own political, economic, diplomatic interests. And Hong Kong is not geopolitically important enough that these two regimes end up with dramatically different approach about Hong Kong's relations with China.
I agree with all the things that the other panelists have said. I would just add that I can kind of like relate. I mean, even though I disagree, I can kind of like relate to the sentiment expressed by some of the people in Hong Kong. Well, first of all, you got to know that for those who are in Hong Kong, when they look at democracy in the U.S., they have the idea of democracy, but they don't really get into the weeds, like say, for example, universal health care, or a universal basic income. This kind of like concrete proposals, they don't really think too much about it. It is about the idea of democracy, and in the Hong Kong context, it is about getting democracy as promised. And I think that explains part of the story. And another part of the story is really many many pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong kind of like think about who can we get to resist a authoritarian China, and it seems that Trump is the figure, albeit a problem figure, to for us to kind of like live vicariously, to experience this kind of like pushing back. So I think that that's part of the reason.
Thank you again for the sharing. So time is running fast. So I guess this marks the end of our discussion. So right now I will hand it over to William for a brief conclusion. Again, thank you everyone for participating in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.